could know what real happiness is. In the privileged and enlightened world in which Lord Russell grew up, all good things then seemed possible, achievable, and indeed almost inevitable. The Great War changed all that. The myth of progress, the myth of human perfectibility no longer seemed plausible. Even more disturbingly, the heretofore unseen horrors of the Great War seemed to validate Friedrich Nietzsche as a prophet, that God is dead, indeed, that we have killed him. We killed him at the Somme. God, goodness, faith, and hope were among the million fallen casualties of that horrific battle. One battle, 1 million casualties. Of that battle and of the Great War, skepticism, doubt, and despair seem to be the only survivors. Yet, among the bards and poets of the time were two extraordinary authors and friends, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. For them, the Great War deepened their spiritual quest and strengthened their conviction of the reality of the transcendent. Both men served as soldiers on the Western Front. They survived the trenches, and they used the experience of that conflict to ignite their literary imaginations. Tolkien said, "My Sam is indeed a reflection of the English soldier, of the privates, and the Batman I knew in 1914, and recognized as far superior to myself." End quote. Tolkien and Lewis insisted that war could inspire noble sacrifice for humane purposes, even in the midst of humankind's darkest depravities. So in this evening's lecture, Dr. Joseph Loconte explores these themes and others in his forthcoming book on the experience of the Great War through the lives of these two 20th century British literary and Christian religious figures, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Dr. Loconte is an associate professor of history at the King's College in New York City, where he teaches Western civilization and American foreign policy. He is the author of several books, including The Searchers, A Quest for Faith in the Valley of Doubt, Thomas Nelson, 2012, Of God, Locke, and Liberty, The Struggle for Religious Freedom in the West, and of the forthcoming God and the Great War, J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and the Crisis of Faith of the Modern Age. Due out 30 June of this year. His commentary on religion and democracy, human rights, and international religious freedom appear in the nation's leading media outlets, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New Republic, the Weekly Standard, and the National Public Radio. He's also a regular contributor to the London-based Standpoint magazine and Italy's La Stampa. He now serves as a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum in Washington, D.C., and perhaps most importantly, at least from our perspective, as an affiliated scholar of the John Jay Institute in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joseph Loconte.
Well, thank you, Al, for that terrific introduction, and thank you all for coming out tonight in this damp, wet evening. Thank you so much here at the Whitfield Academy and the Georgia Center for sponsoring this event. Great to be with you. You can probably tell already, I'm not a local boy. Not a local boy, but that's all right. New Yorker, Italian New Yorker, born in Brooklyn. Great to be down here in Georgia. You know, I think I've only been in Georgia once before in the last 10 or 12, 15 years. And I was struck. Here's the difference between getting a cup of coffee in New York and getting a cup of coffee in Georgia. Here's the difference. You go to New York and sit down, and then here's what you hear from the waitress. Are you done with your coffee? Are you done with your coffee? Do you want your bill? Let's go, pal. Come to Georgia, you get this. Do you want some more pie with that coffee? We can use a little Southern hospitality up north. That's all I'm saying. Well, it's great to be with you. So let's just get into it. The last soldier to die in the Great War was an American, a guy named Henry Gunther, a private with the American Expeditionary Force in France. He was killed at 10:59 a.m., November 11th, 1918, 1 minute before the armistice went into effect. was 23 years old. Gunther's squad had encountered a roadblock of German machine guns near the village of Chaumont-d'Avillé, and against the orders of his sergeant, he charged the guns with his bayonet. German soldiers, aware of the armistice, tried to wave them off. But Gunther kept coming and was gunned down. He died instantly. His divisional record states, almost as he fell, the gunfire died away and an appalling silence prevailed. Well, despite the parties and the parades marking the end of the First World War, and here's an example. President Wilson on his way to Paris, arriving in Paris, for the Treaty of Versailles, a brutal and appalling silence fell over much of the world. It was the stillness of souls anguished and bewildered by the carnage of the most destructive war the world had ever seen. Historian Paul Johnson has called the conflict, quote, the primal tragedy of modern world civilization. The main reason why the 20th century turned into such a disastrous epic for mankind. This man, you'll recognize some of you, a young Winston Churchill, who fought in the war, described it this way: injuries were wrought to the structure of human society which a century will not efface and which may conceivably prove fatal to the present civilization. As Alan said, we marked the centennial of that tragedy. Last year, at the beginning of that tragedy, the war to make the world safe for democracy, the war to end all wars, the war to usher in the kingdom of heaven. And instead, the Great War laid waste to a continent and destroyed the hopes and the lives of a generation. Before it was all over, nearly every family in Europe was grieving the loss of a family member, or helping others to grieve, or caring for a wounded soldier, struggling to adjust to civilian life. Like no other force in history, the First World War permanently damaged the mental and the moral outlook of European society. It ushered in a season of cynicism and agnosticism toward the values and the ideals of the West. For a generation of men and women, it brought the end of innocence, it brought the end of faith. But as Alan suggests, for two remarkable authors and friends, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, the Great War ignited their spiritual quest, their spiritual journey. Both of these men served on the Western Front. They endured the trenches, and they survived that experience. And I think it profoundly shaped their Christian imagination. J.R.R. Tolkien creates The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, one of the best-selling novels ever written, and among the most influential books of the 20th century. And his friend, C.S. Lewis, earns fame for the Chronicles of Narnia, of course, a series of children's books now ranked among the classics. It can be argued that these epic tales involving what? The sorrows and the triumphs of war would never have been written had these men not been flung into the furnace of combat. Listen to Winston Churchill. Battles are won by slaughter and maneuver. The greater the general, the more he contributes to maneuver and the less he demands in slaughter. But the generals of this war demanded much in slaughter. By the time of the armistice, nearly 10 million soldiers lay dead, maybe 4 times that number wounded. On average, and here's a number that just shocks the conscience, on average, there were about 6,046 men killed every day of the war. Every day, for a war that lasted 1,566 days. Tolkien and Lewis might easily have been among the number of those men. As a second lieutenant in the British Expeditionary Force, Tolkien spent many days and nights under fire on the Western Front. And he fought at the Battle of the Somme, one of the fiercest concentrations of killing in the history of human conflict. Listen to Tolkien reflecting. One has indeed personally to come under the shadow of war to feel its full oppression. It now seems often forgotten that to be caught in youth by 1914 was no less hideous an experience than to be involved in 1939 and the following years. And he goes on, by 1918, he says, all but one of my close friends were dead. Also commissioned as a second lieutenant in the British Army Lewis was sent immediately to the front, arriving on his 19th birthday. Anybody out here 19 years old right now? Just out of curiosity, 19-year-olds? Well, happy birthday, 19-year-old. Happy birthday, man, 19, on the Western Front. On the experience of 6 months of trench warfare. It remains with Lewis throughout his life. My memories of the last war, he said, haunted my dreams for years. Lewis would describe the emotion of grief in one of his other works as, quote, the steady barrage on a trench in World War I, hours of it with no let-up for a moment. Like Tolkien, Lewis lost most of his closest friends in the conflict. By the mid-1920s, Tolkien and Lewis arrived at Oxford University, where they take up their vocations as instructors in English literature. And they meet for the first time in 1926. And a bond of friendship is established that will transform their lives and their careers. Tolkien will play a crucial role in Lewis's conversion from atheism to Christianity, while Lewis will persuade Tolkien to pursue his story about hobbits and to complete The Lord of the Rings. Well, given the massive influence of their works, it's hard to think of a more consequential friendship in the 20th century than this one. And I think we need to appreciate just how out of step both these authors were with their times. Both men wrote these epic tales, awash in the themes of what? War, sacrifice, valor, and friendship. They create mythic worlds torn apart by a struggle between good and evil. They use the backdrop of a global conflict as the crucible for moral and spiritual growth. These were not the kinds of stories that people were writing in the post-war years, as Alan brilliantly reminded us. Many veterans composed anti-war novels and memoirs and poetry. Many educated men and women became moral cynics, sneering at the very idea of heroism or virtue. In the years after the conflict, the cruelty and the senselessness of the war, of any war for any reason, became the dominant themes of a generation. The writings of authors such as Robert Graves, his novel Say Goodbye to All That, Ernest Hemingway, A Farewell to Arms, T.S. Eliot, The Hollow Men, Eric Remarque, All Quiet on the Western Front, reinforce all these themes in the public mind. And the watchword, friends, the watchword is disillusionment. Disillusionment. A fierce cynicism about liberal democracy, about Christianity, about the achievements of Western civilization. Disillusionment. The unprecedented butchery of the war also created a feeling of helplessness, a kind of psychological gloom among the survivors. The shell-shocked veteran, that's where we get that phrase from, the First World War. The shell-shocked veteran became a walking metaphor for much of post-war Europe. You may remember the main character in All Quiet on the Western Front, who expects to return to civilian life, weary, broken, burnt out, rootless, and without hope. And that mood is acute among the writers, the artists, the public intellectuals. It affects ordinary people as well. Dismay was a mainstream concern, writes one historian, Richard Overy. For the generation living after the end of the First World War, the prospect of imminent crisis, a new dark age, became a habitual way of looking at the world. And although his Catholic faith remained intact, Tolkien, quote, as he put it, bemoaned the collapse of all my world that began with his deployment to the Western Front. Tolkien was demobilized from the British force, July 16, 1919, moves back to Oxford with his wife, Edith, his infant son, John. He gets a professorship of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford in 1925. But his early academic success cannot erase the heartache of war. And so he experienced what he said, what he described as a time of sorrow and mental suffering. The loss of so many friends to the war produced, in the words of his children, a lifelong sadness. C.S. Lewis went into the war as an atheist, and he came out an atheist, with The Atheist in the Foxhole. He wrote a war poem, in 1918, 1919, with these lines. For all our hopes in endless ruin lie, the good is dead, let us curse God most high. That's Lewis in 1919. Wounded in combat in April 1918, Lewis is sent to a hospital bed in Bristol where he writes to his father, "I could sit down and cry over the whole business. Nearly all my friends in the battalion are gone." Lewis returns to Oxford in January 1919 to resume his studies in the classics, and a few years later, he records in his diary a conversation with a guy named the Doc, the uncle of a fellow soldier who was himself a war veteran. Lewis and the Doc went for an evening walk. Here's what Lewis writes in his journal. "I don't know how, but we fell to talking of death on the material side and all the other horrors hanging over one. The Doc said that if you stopped to think, you couldn't endure this world for an hour. I left him and walked home." Well, many post-war thinkers and writers were unwilling to endure the world in its current form. A kind of spiritual vertigo took hold, a frantic search for solutions to the human predicament. So what do we see? We see Freudian psychology, spiritualism, scientism, socialism. These and other ideologies are attempts to solve or to explain away the horrors that seem to be hanging over the human race. By the 1920s, these ideas are just gaining all kinds of ground in Europe and in the United States. Well, these facts make the literary aims of Tolkien and Lewis, I think, all the more remarkable because they reject the moral agnosticism and ambivalence that had so infected so much of the output of their era. Critics accuse these guys, as you might know, of nostalgia and of medieval escapism, stories with knights, queens, princes, and all the rest of it. Well, these authors wrap their tales in fantasy and in myth, yes, but they do this in order to convey hard truths about the human condition, its darkness, its futility, as well as its virtues and its triumphs, as Lewis explains. And man as a whole, man pitted against the universe, have we seen him at all until we see that he's like a hero in a fairy tale? Tolkien and Lewis were attracted to myth and to romance, I think, not because they sought to escape the world, but because for them the real world has a mythic and heroic quality. Why? Because it's the setting for great conflicts and great quests. It creates scenes of remorseless violence and grief and suffering, as well as deep compassion, valor, and sacrifice. So let's try to understand this vision with our time remaining. Let's unpack their vision. First, Tolkien and Lewis are utterly realistic about the corrupting influence of power. They're utterly realistic about the corrupting influence of power. The desire for power, often disguised by appeals to religion or to morals, is a recurring theme in their works. No character in their stories, really, is immune to this temptation to power. Think about Lewis's Prince Caspian. Nickabrick, initially a soldier in the fight for Narnia, right? Turns traitor when Aslan, the great lion, fails to come to their aid. Nickabrick makes the appalling suggestion that his comrades enlist the help of the White Witch. "You may drop Aslan out of the reckoning," he says. "We want power, and we want a power that will be on our side." Well, in Tolkien's trilogy, we learn that Saruman, the wizard, originally committed to helping Middle-earth in the struggle against Mordor, has fallen under the sway of the Ring of Power. Prudence, he now says, demands a temporary compromise with Sauron, the Dark Lord. Here's how he puts it. "We can bide our time, we can keep our thoughts in our hearts, deploring maybe evils done by the way, but approving the high and ultimate purpose." So here the effect of the Great War on these authors, I think, is manifest. Despite an appeal to lofty moral principles, none of the combatant nations resisted using the most horrific weapons available against the enemy. The mortars, the machine guns, the tanks, the poison gas, starvation. Listen to Winston Churchill on this. When it was all over, torture and cannibalism were the only two expedients that the civilized, scientific Christian states had been able to deny themselves, he writes, and these were of doubtful utility. Classic Churchill line. Cannibalism of doubtful utility, right? And remember the social aftermath of the war. Communism, fascism, Nazism, eugenics. Friends, These were the revolutions and the ideologies that arose in the exhaustion of the democracies of Europe. All in the name of advancing the human race. All began by promising liberation from oppression. All became instruments of totalitarian control. Tolkien and Lewis are acutely aware of these ideologies, and they react against them. They push back in their writings. They've got no illusions about the corrosive influence of power. Second point, Tolkien and Lewis recover the concept of heroism in an age of moral cynicism. Heroism in an age of moral cynicism. And the heroism in the stories, it's not defined by a single act of bravery, right? The hero is the product of what? The kind of work you guys do here in the school. A well-formed character. A well-formed character. The hero emerges because of a series of choices to put the welfare of other people ahead of his or her own desires. But the industrialized slaughter of the First World War had damaged the very idea of choice, of moral agency, of free will. Think about it. Millions of men had been flung into the ghastly machinery of a conflict that robbed them of their humanity. They were mutilated, bombed, bayoneted, gassed, incinerated, and obliterated without mercy. The utter helplessness of the individual soldier on the Western Front was a recurring theme of the post-war literature, and that fatalism just extended to society at large. Here are some book titles that kind of tell the story throughout the 1920s and 30s. 1920, The End of the World. 1921, Social Decay and Degeneration. 1923, The Decay of Capitalist Civilization. 1926, The Twilight of the White Races. 1927-28, Spain was the decline of the West. 1927, will civilization crash? 1928, the day after tomorrow, what's going to happen to the world? 1931, the problem of decadence. 1933, the dance of death. You get the point. Imagine a Loconte book club. Come on, Loconte, talk about the dance of death. Well, that's the move, friends. That's the move. Tolkien and Lewis reject this mental outlook, this fatalism. They insist that every person is caught up in a great moral contest, and that our choices in this contest matter supremely. Remember the scene in the Chronicles of Narnia? And the horse and his boy? Shasta and Aravis, helped by the talking horses, race across the desert to warn Narnia of the approaching army of Rabadash, bent on Narnia's destruction. Before reaching their goal, they're attacked by a lion. Aravis, further behind, is moments from being cut down by this beast. And Shasta has a choice. Stop, bellowed Shasta in Bree's ear. Must go back. Must help. Shasta slipped his feet out of the stirrups, slid both his legs over the left side, hesitated for one hideous hundredth of a second, and jumped. It hurt horribly and nearly winded him, but before he knew how it hurt him, he was staggering back to help Aravis. He'd never done anything like this in his life before and hardly knew why he was doing it now. Well, such scenes would be familiar, think about it, to many combatants in the Great War. The image of the soldier throwing himself in harm's way to rescue the fallen comrade. Think of the scene in The Lord of the Rings, when the hobbits encounter Lady Galadriel, the fairest of the elves in Middle-earth, and as they gather before her, she fixes her eyes on each of them and delivers this word. The quest stands upon the edge of a knife. Stray but a little, and it will fail, to the ruin of all. Well, what are they to do? Each of them is faced with the appalling clarity now of the choice before them, to continue in the quest into certain dangers and deprivations, or take the safe and the easy way and turn back. Listen to Tolkien. All of them, it seemed, had fair light. Each had felt that he was offered a choice between a shadow full of fear that lay ahead and something that he greatly desired, he writes. Clear before his mind it lay, and to get it, he had only to turn aside from the road and leave the quest and the war against Sauron to others. Well, the bedrock belief in the responsibility to resist evil gives the writings of Tolkien and Lewis their dignity and their power. It's the reason that their stories, so fantastical in style, seem to speak into our present reality, isn't it? The war against evil is the moral landscape of our mortal lives. Whatever form that evil takes in our world, friends, we're called to resist it. By insisting on our responsibility to resist evil, Tolkien and Lewis retrieve this medieval concept of the heroic quest. The heroic quest. Think of Beowulf or the Death of Arthur. They reinvent this tale for the modern mind. And in an era that exalted cynicism and irony, Tolkien and Lewis sought to reclaim this older tradition of the epic hero. Why? There's a question for the historian. Why? Why did Tolkien and Lewis, ignoring the most powerful trends of their culture, embark on this task? I think part of the answer actually lies in the battlefields of France. I had a chance to visit this particular memorial. Peaceful Memorial, the largest memorial to fallen British soldiers anywhere in the world. In France, well, it was there in the battlefields as young soldiers that these men encountered these virtues in the officers and the privates and the medics on the Western Front. It was there, according to Tolkien, that the inspiration for his most beloved mythic character occurred. Where did Tolkien get the idea for the Hobbit in the first place? Well, after he became a professor at Oxford, he's sitting down and grading student papers. Some teachers in the audience over here? Any teachers out there? Yeah, a few. Any teachers love grading papers? No, none of us do. No, we don't. He's grading student papers. He finds a blank sheet in the pile. And he's, finally, a blank sheet of paper. Great. He starts scrawling these words on the blank sheet of paper. In a hole in the ground, they're adopt. In a hole in the ground, they're adopt. Later on, he reflects, eventually I thought I'd better find out what hobbits were like. We don't know why Tolkien wrote those words. He doesn't know why he wrote those words. But we do know what hobbits are like, don't we? And from Tolkien's own account, the character of the hobbit is a reflection of the ordinary soldier, the British soldier, steadfast in his duties while suffering in that dreary hole in the ground, the frontline trench. Many of the members of the British Expeditionary Force were citizen soldiers, drawn from the working classes. And unlike the French and the Italians and the Russian armies, the British did not experience a large-scale collapse in discipline or morale. They did not. Even during the most intensive campaigns along the Western Front, the British Army showed, in the words of one historian, a remarkable resilience relative to other armies. They hung on. The change in character that overcomes Sam Gamgee in The Lord of the Rings is probably not unlike the transformation that Tolkien must have witnessed among his fellow soldiers in battle. Listen to Tolkien. But even as hope died in Sam, or seemed to die, it was turned to a new strength. Sam's plain hobbit face grew stern, almost grim, as the will hardened in him, and he felt through all his limbs a thrill, as if he was turning into some creature of stone and steel that neither despair, nor weariness, nor endless barren miles could subdue. So, one of the most beloved heroic figures in modern literature is based on Tolkien's first-hand knowledge of the virtues of the men in the trenches of the Great War. Listen to Tolkien. I have always been impressed that we are here, surviving, because of the indomitable courage of quite small people against impossible odds. My Sam Gamgee is indeed a reflection of the English soldier, of the privates that I knew in the 1914 war, and recognized as so far superior to myself. There it is. Well, the same could be said of any number of characters in Lewis's stories for children. Often it's the humblest, or the smallest, like a mouse named Rikachi, who displays the greatest valor on the battlefield, isn't it? As soldiers, Tolkien and Lewis lived among these quite small people, witnessed their courage under fire, joked with them, mourned with them, and watched them die. As veterans of the most destructive war the world had ever seen, they could not glorify its violence and its anguish, but neither could they accept the fatalism and the cynicism that had become so prevalent. Wilfred Owen's raging anthem against the war, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, could not be the final word, not for them. So we have the concept of heroism, reinvigorated and reinterpreted for the modern mind. Third, Tolkien and Lewis upheld the importance of friendship in our common struggle against evil. Friendship in our common struggle against evil. The heroic quest is not a solitary endeavor. Historian Stephen Ambrose reminded us of this with his book, Band of Brothers. Who's seen any part of the Band of Brothers TV show? Anybody out there? I'll make the common ground now, all right? The basis of that HBO miniseries is the story, of course, of the men of E Company, America's 101st Airborne, during the Second World War. And listen to Stephen Ambrose. Within E Company, they made the best friends they ever had or would ever have, Ambrose writes. They were prepared to die for each other. More important, they were prepared to kill for each other. And this fact about the experience of combat was as relevant for the soldiers who went off to fight in 1914 as it was for those in 1939. For Tolkien and Lewis, their personal knowledge of the fellowship of men under fire, I think, must rank as another defining experience of their literary lives. Lewis first established friendships like this with his brother Warnie, also a soldier in the British Army, whom he called his dearest and closest friend, who understood the anxieties of combat, and with a guy named Lawrence Johnson, who fought alongside Lewis on the Western Front and shared his love of literature and philosophy. Reflecting years later, Lewis said that this guy Johnson, quote, would have been a lifelong friend if he had not been killed. He was moving toward theism, belief in God. And we had endless arguments, Lewis says, on that and every other topic whenever we were out of the line of fire. Can you just see Lewis and this guy arguing theology? The bombs are flying overhead. It's exactly what they're doing. The theme of friendship pulses through each of the Narnia stories, if you think about it, like a force of nature. It might even be said that friendship replaces romance as the preeminent expression of love in Lewis's stories. It flourishes among the children, right? Between the children and the noble Narnians, and between Aslan and all who serve him in love and obedience. It's friendship. Listen to Lewis, turning to the experience of war to explain what distinguishes the love among friends from all other kinds of love. Listen to Lewis. You'll not find the warrior, the poet, the philosopher, or the Christian by staring into his eyes as if he were your mistress. Better to fight beside him, read with him, argue with him, pray with him. And it's the same for Tolkien, who was devoted to his inner circle of friends at the King's Edward School in Birmingham, his band of brothers. In 1916, they held their own war meeting in London. They called it the Council of London, expecting to be sent into the theater of war at any moment. And there at that meeting, they shared their deepest hopes and their dreams for the future. Friends, is it a coincidence? Is it a coincidence that the concept of friendship amid the suffering of war is one of the great themes of The Lord of the Rings? Frodo, joined in his quest by his friends from the Shire, Sam, Merry, Pippin, and then the hobbits, of course, in addition to them, Aragorn, the Ranger of the North, Legolas, King of the Elves, Gimli, the noble line of dwarves, and of course, Gandalf the Grey, the Fellowship of the Ring. The Fellowship of the Ring. When Frodo arrives in Crick Hollow, before setting out into the Old Forest, he's determined to leave on his own. He doesn't want to expose his companions, right, to the perils that lie ahead. But Merry, Pippin, and Sam, they get wise to his plans, and they confront him before he can slip away, and they insist on coming with him. Frodo, deeply moved, protests. But it doesn't seem that I can trust anyone, he says. Merry is unflappable. It all depends on what you want. You can trust us to stick to you through thick and thin, to the bitter end. And you can trust us to keep any secret of yours closer than you keep it yourself. But you cannot trust us to let you face trouble alone and go off without a word. We're your friends, Frodo. We know a good deal about the ring. We are horribly afraid, but we're coming with you or following you like hounds. Do we have some friends like that in life who are following us like hounds? Well, the bond of friendship between Sam Gamgee and Frodo Baggins is one of the moral triumphs of the work, isn't it? Remember when they're at the threshold of Mount Doom? They're at the end of their quest, and they're weak from thirst and exhaustion, Sam and Frodo. They're nearly overwhelmed by the desolation of the landscape, the lack of another living thing, the black skies, the noxious fumes, the ash and the slag and the burned stone, and the smell of death. It is a scene not unlike what Tolkien experienced at the Battle of the Somme. They stagger toward their goal. Frodo, weakened by the great burden of carrying the ring, begins to crawl on his hands. Listen to Tolkien. Sam looked at him and wept in his heart, but no tears came to his dry and stinging eyes. I said I'd carry him if it broke my back, he muttered, and I will. Come, Mr. Frodo, he cried. I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you and you as well. So up you get. Come on, Mr. Frodo, dear. Sam will give you a ride. Just tell him where to go and he'll go. I firmly believe that only individuals who knew friendship of this kind, who experienced it in the field of combat, could write passages of such grit and courage and nobility. Well, after the war, Tolkien and Lewis sought to recapture something like the intense comradeship that sustained them during the crisis years of 1914 and 1918. Oxford. At Oxford, they launched the Inklings, those who dabble in ink. The group of friends and fellow scholars who met weekly to read and discuss their works. Tolkien helps Lewis to find a publisher for his first science fiction novel, Out of the Silent Planet, back in 1938. But more importantly, it was Tolkien's conversation with Lewis on the night of September 19th, 1931. Along this path, and then back into Lewis's rooms at Addison's Walk, they talked until 2 in the morning about the nature of myths, about Christianity as the true myth. It was this conversation that Lewis described as the immediate human cause of his conversion to Christianity. Well, for his part, Lewis became Tolkien's great advocate for pursuing his hobbitry. And as Tolkien said, Lewis's gift was his sheer encouragement over many years to keep on. Listen to Tolkien. Lewis was for long my only audience. Only from him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby. But for his interest and unceasing eagerness, Tolkien says, his eagerness for more, I should never have brought The Lord of the Rings to a conclusion. Wow. When Lewis learned that The Lord of the Rings had been accepted for publication, guess the thing done after several years of work. Finally, got a publisher.